Welcome back to Les Schwab Tire Center's Outdoor GPS, presented by Fisherman's Marine and Outdoor. Now it's time for your weekend tech tip, brought to you by Chevy Silverado.
And yet another Chevy Silverado tech tip. Chevy Silverado, thank you very much for making that happen. All right, so we got a question a couple of weeks ago. It was specifically about hook placement for stuffer baits and about just running cut plug herring. So I'm going to take that a little bit further since I have the time today. First thing we're going to show or talk about is just the regular, everyday, two-hook mooching rig, fixed mooching rig. I will say that there is a large contingent of folks out there that still like to have a slider on their two-hook mooching rig, and that's absolutely fine as long as you tie that slider correctly so that it's, you know, pinned enough to where it's not going to move on its own, but yet tight enough that if that fish did get that front hook, the part that's actually the slider, that you get penetration. And we'll talk about that in the next setup because that'll be a three-hook setup, which is what I'm kind of adding to this. So this is not rocket science. We've shown this exact tech tip probably a few hundred times, it seems like, over the years, and any number of sources that are out there. Great sources for this kind of stuff when GPS isn't actually live here on KPDX. YouTube is a great source. You can find a lot of really good videos that folks have put up there, and some of our clips of tech tips in the past that have shown this exact setup, okay? But here's how I like to do it. The one thing that I'm going to mention that I'm changing this year is because I actually I have become a believer, and I've said this right to Scott Space when he was here. I would not typically have used Brad's hooks just a handful of years ago. They've completely changed their hooks in the last 2 years. I will put these up again. I have had zero issue with these Brad's hooks. Previously, they were very inexpensive and made that way, and you could find out in a hurry. These ones I have not. I'm going to be running 4/0 hooks. I will say, though, that based on other manufacturing sizes that are out there, all of them seem to have their own version of what a 4/0 or a 5/0 or a 3/0 is. In my case, I've always been a 3/0 person. Sometimes I would go to a 4/0 depending on what I was doing, if I was maybe fishing blues or if I was on the coast, if I was doing something different. Typically for springers, I'm running 3/0s. With these hooks, they run a little bit smaller. So it's kind of like an in-between stir. So with these 4/0s, it's a little bit bigger than the standard 3/0s that I typically use, but smaller than a 5/0. So it's kind of an in-between stir. I really like the size of these 4/0s. But anyway, that's just me. Everyone's different. But here's how I like to do it. I get that bottom one tied on. That's just your standard egg loop down there. I do cut that tag in a little bit short so that I can lay it right alongside the hook itself, so when it does go through the herring, it doesn't, poke a huge hole in it. In the end, as long as you take a little bit of time, you can get that hook through the herring without shredding it with that bottom hook. You just have to pay a little bit of attention. That being said, now, placement for that front hook. I do like a little bit more than 4-finger across, just a sliver, okay? I want to make sure that when I'm running a green, this is for green label, okay? When I cut plug it, I take the head off, that when I place this front hook, that this trailer hook, 9 out of 10 times, is going to be either at the tip of that herring or slightly behind. I don't want it in front of the tail of that herring at all. If I do, for whatever reason, have a little bit larger green label, and that hook is interfering or somewhere near the shank of this hook, I cut the tail off. Other than that, I typically don't cut the tails off, but again, that's just my theory. Everybody's going to have their own take on it. That's just what I do. But in the end, I want a 4-finger gap there, a little loose 4-finger gap, and this is where the question came in. The individual was concerned on which knot you would tie here for that fixed setup, and this is it. It's just another egg loop. The only thing I do different here is I'm running 30-pound fluorocarbon P-line. I want 7 wraps or 8. Typically, if I'm going to be doing like an egg loop or something like that, then I'm going to specifically be running eggs. I'd go 9 or 10 wraps, but since this is just for a mooching rig, I do go a little bit less. 7 or 8 is fine. Behind it is very important. I go a minimum of 4 wraps behind it, and you can go 5, doesn't matter. If you go less than that, what I found with this fluorocarbon, any kind, it doesn't matter if it's P-line, if it's Shinsi, if it's any of the other versions of fluoro from P-line, it's a little bit stiffer of a line, right, than say mono. And if you don't have enough wraps behind that on that egg loop, sometimes it'll want to come undone because of just the way it's rigid. So what you end up with here is a nice gap, a little bit more than 4 fingers from the bottom of the shank to the eye of the hook. And that's going to give you a pretty darn good spacing for a cut plug green label herring. So that's one answer to that question. Now, here's where I'm expanding this just a little bit, because if you don't know this one, and Shane or Ryan, if I start to run long here, just holler at me. I'll fix it. Here is a fixed mooching rig. This has just got a tight 2-finger gap, okay? I don't want it to be any more than that. Just 2 fingers from here to here. These are fixed. Same exact setup that I just did before, just half the gap. Now I got another 4/0 sitting on top of it, and this is where the slider is going to go. Now, a lot of the times I won't use mono. I'll use either a 40-pound or a 50-pound braid for my slider, or Dacron, going old school. You can use monofilament. I would use minimum of 15-pound, but I wouldn't go much more than 20, just because sometimes it's difficult to get it to really grab onto the leader so it doesn't slide too easily, which is the hard part here when you're talking about a slider. This is where most people get confused with the slider, and it's nothing to get confused about. It's very, very simple. You're just going to make sure that your leader is out of the way and that you run that 12-pound, 15-pound mono, which is what I have here. This is just CXX. I'm actually tying these to where I'm going to fish them. My thought is I will be fishing these. So I've already got my spacing, length, and everything. All you're going to do here is you're going to tie another egg loop, but you're going to obviously have that tag in, so that makes things a little bit more difficult. You're just going to tie another egg loop, but you're going to add a lot more wraps here. And you can only go 2 or 3 at a time before you got to start separating everything out, so that you can keep the wraps going. But I'm going to go about 15 wraps here. And the reason for that is I want more contact with this material for the slider than I would typically have if I was just to tie my mooching rig, right? It's just going to be longer up the shank of the hook. And we are doing this live, and I probably should have cut that a little bit shorter. I do have my cheaters on, so at least I got that going. So there's 12. Let's go with lucky number 13. All right, so now I've got all the wraps on there. I'm going to come back behind it, and I'm going to finish this egg loop off, just like I would if I was just tying a regular knot. I'm not going to go crazy. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put 4 wraps behind it. 3, 4. Then I'm going to clear that excess. I'm going to pull the leader out. And then I'm going to tighten this guy up. And here's where it gets tricky. Now it's all tied. All I got to do is cut the tag end off of that mono that I just used. But you want to kind of slide it up a little bit, seat all the wraps, but you don't want to get it too tight, okay? Here's where the trick is. When you're pulling it tight, you want to set all your loops, okay, all your wraps, and then you want to feel that, right? All you want to do is just give it a good tug, and I would almost call that perfect. Yeah. On the first shot. You want to make it difficult to move by hand. You want it to be impossible to move by just the herring. And then when you get done, I heard you, Ryan. When you get done, you're going to end up with that right there. And I do leave that tag in a little bit long, because if I need to tighten that up, I can grab it with my teeth and just kind of pull on it, get it a little bit tighter. But right now, it's pretty much perfect. So what you're going to do, this 3-hook setup is very, very versatile. You can use this as any normal setup. You can run it, slide it down just a little bit, get it a lot closer to that 4-finger gap that you would have for your typical mooching rig. You can just run that through, run your 2 hooks through your bait, the short side of your bait, and then run this up through the left side or the long side of the spine of a cut plug, and just run it like that and have these 2 hooks dangling. Here's where I like the slider, though. Now it leaves you options. You can either run a whole herring and utilize that front hook between the eyes and then cinch that nose down, and then obviously have the ability to slide it to get your spacing right on that particular bait if it's whole. But also, if it is a cut plug herring, you can run this just normal and then embed this middle hook into that back third right on the lateral line of your herring, and embed that in there so that this trailing hook is just whipping right on the outside of the tail. It's a beautiful look, and it gives you an extra hook in there. And there's been a number of times that we've talked about here over the years where I sure wish I had a hook in the middle, where they'll come up and just basically bite your herring in half and somehow not get a hook. If you can get the roll correct, which is where you really got to be willing to just burn through baits. I know it's frustrating, but with that setup right here, it's just versatile. It gives you choices. You can go whole herring, cut plug. You can embed that second hook so it doesn't kick around. You can just let it dangle like normal, but it does give you that third hook. It's a little bit more, if you're new at herring fishing, it's a little bit more of an advanced setup, I guess. But in the end, it's nothing to be intimidated by. You're just adding on that slider. And that slider knot is something that you really want to master. Either a 40 or 50 pound braid works great. 15 pound mono also works great. It's a little bit more finicky, or old school Dacron, which a lot of you, if you're new, might not even know what that is. All right, when we come back, I've got a couple of phone calls. I'm going to try to get them all in, and we're going to have a wrap up for the remainder of the show. But don't go anywhere. We got some great questions and calls that we're going to be answering. We'll be right back.
Outdoor GPS is brought to you by Yakima Bait, steeped in tradition, innovation, and fishing success. Procure Bait Sense, ruthlessly effective. And by North American Metals Incorporated, first choice for all your metal roofing and siding needs.